July 28, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Apartment building, Rothenbaum District, Hamburg, Germany. Frau Hildegard Weiss stood at her kitchen window, ignoring the air raid sirens wailing across the city. At 42 years old, she had endured 3 years of these false alarms. British bombers that dropped leaflets instead of bombs, raids that hit industrial areas miles away, warnings that produced nothing but interrupted sleep. More propaganda, she muttered to her neighbor, Frau Schmidt, who had knocked to ask about seeking shelter. The British dropped their lying papers saying Hamburg will burn. Goebbels is right, they're trying to break our will with empty threats. On her kitchen table lay one of the leaflets that had fallen from the sky 2 weeks earlier. Bold text in German warned, "Hamburg will be destroyed. Evacuation is your only hope. The firestorm is coming." Hildegard had laughed when she read it. Firestorm? Ridiculous. Hamburg had the best civil defense system in Germany. 40,000 trained firefighters, bomb shelters everywhere, anti-aircraft batteries protecting every approach. The British were desperate, resorting to scare tactics because they couldn't win militarily. "I'm staying here," Hildegard announced. "I won't let Churchill's lies send me running like a frightened rabbit. The Führer promised Hamburg is protected. These are just terror tactics." Frau Schmidt hesitated, then nodded. The newspapers had said the same thing. The radio broadcasts mocked British fantasy weapons and imaginary tactics. Even the leaflets themselves proved how desperate the enemy was. If they could really destroy cities, why would they warn first? What Hildegard Weiss didn't know, what none of Hamburg's won. 7 million civilians could have imagined. Was that the leaflet on her kitchen table was not propaganda? It was a precise prediction written by analysts who had calculated exactly how to create an artificial firestorm using incendiary bombs, specific weather conditions, and overwhelming concentration of force. In 23 minutes, Operation Gomorrah would begin. Within 48 hours, 42,600 German civilians would be dead. Hildegard Weiss would be among them, suffocated in her apartment as temperatures outside reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Frau Schmidt would survive, but would spend the rest of her life haunted by the realization that the propaganda leaflet had been absolutely accurate. The firestorm that German civilians mocked as impossible Allied fantasy was about to demonstrate that sometimes propaganda isn't lies, sometimes it's a promise. This is the story of how German civilians dismissed Allied warnings as psychological warfare, how Nazi propaganda convinced millions that enemy threats were empty, and how the most accurate intelligence campaign in history was ignored until the bombers came exactly as predicted, turning German cities into infernos that proved every mocked warning had been true. The psychological warfare campaign against German civilian morale began in earnest in 1942, after the Luftwaffe's blitz against British cities had been halted and reversed. The RAF's Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, had developed a comprehensive strategy: break German industrial production and civilian will through systematic destruction of German cities. But Harris understood that bombs alone wouldn't win the war. The German people needed to know what was coming, needed to understand that their government couldn't protect them, needed to lose faith in Nazi promises of victory. The solution was a propaganda campaign unprecedented in scale and specificity. Not vague threats, but precise predictions. Not general warnings, but exact descriptions of tactics, targets, and effects. Starting in March 1942, RAF bombers began dropping leaflets over German cities alongside their explosive payloads. But these weren't crude propaganda screeds. They were technically accurate intelligence briefings written as public warnings. A leaflet dropped over Cologne in May 1942 read, "Citizens of Cologne, on the night of May 30th, the Royal Air Force will attack your city with 1,000 bombers. This is not a threat. This is a statement of operational fact. Your government cannot stop this attack. Your anti-aircraft defenses will be overwhelmed. Your fire services will be inadequate. Seek shelter in rural areas. This is your only protection." German civilians who read these leaflets laughed. 1,000 bombers? Impossible. The Luftwaffe's largest raid on London had involved 500 aircraft. The British couldn't possibly assemble twice that number. This was obviously desperate propaganda meant to cause panic. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, seized on the leaflets to demonstrate British weakness. In a radio broadcast on May 25, 1942, he addressed the nation. The enemy drops paper on our cities because they cannot drop effective bombs. They make fantastic claims, 1,000 bombers, because reality is too disappointing. They warn of destruction they cannot deliver. This is the propaganda of desperation, and it proves we are winning. The German press published the leaflets alongside mocking commentary. Der Stürmer ran a headline, "British fantasy weapons, enemy claims magical bomber force." I see. I can't. The article explained that Britain's actual bomber strength was perhaps 300 operational aircraft, making the 1,000 bomber claim obviously false. German civil defense authorities reinforced this message. In Cologne, city officials held public meetings assuring citizens that Allied warnings were psychological warfare with no basis in reality. Herr Friedrich Weber, Cologne's civil defense coordinator, stated publicly, "These leaflets are designed to create panic and disrupt war production. The British want you to flee your jobs and homes based on impossible threats. Your government has invested enormous resources in civil defense. Cologne has 200 public shelters, 8,000 basement reinforcements, and anti-aircraft protection that makes our city nearly impenetrable. Stay calm. Continue working. Ignore enemy lies." On the night of May 30th to 31st, 1942, exactly as the leaflet predicted, 1,047 RAF bombers attacked Cologne in Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid. The attack devastated 600 acres of the city center. Over 3,300 buildings were destroyed, 469 civilians died, with 5,000 injured. The raid produced fires visible for 100 miles. But more devastating than the physical damage was the psychological impact. The British hadn't lied. The impossible bomber force existed. The propaganda had been precisely accurate, date, numbers, effect. German civilians who had mocked the leaflets now faced a terrifying realization. If the British could accurately predict one attack, what about all the other warnings? Goebbels moved quickly to control the narrative. Within 48 hours, German radio announced that the Cologne raid had been a failure. Yes, some damage occurred, but German defenses shot down 200 British bombers. Actual losses, 40. Yes, some civilians died, but production continued. The raid proved British desperation, not strength. They expended enormous resources for minimal effect. Goebbels announced, "This proves they cannot sustain such attacks." The 1,000-bomber raid was an anomaly born of desperation, not a repeatable tactic. Most German civilians wanted to believe this. The alternative, that Allied warnings were accurate and more attacks were coming, was too terrifying to accept. Cologne residents who had fled to the countryside before the raid were criticized for cowardice and falling for enemy propaganda. The pattern established itself. Allies would drop specific warnings. German propaganda would mock them as impossible lies. The attacks would occur exactly as predicted. German propaganda would minimize the damage and claim it couldn't be repeated. Through late 1942 and into 1943, the warnings became more specific and more disturbing. Leaflets dropped over Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin didn't just threaten destruction, they explained exactly how it would happen. A leaflet distributed over Hamburg in June 1943 contained information that seemed impossible for the enemy to possess. Citizens of Hamburg, the RAF has developed tactics to create artificial firestorms using high-explosive bombs to shatter buildings, followed by incendiary bombs to ignite exposed interiors. When sufficient fires merge, they create a self-sustaining firestorm with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour and temperatures over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This firestorm will consume oxygen, suffocate those in shelters, and incinerate those above ground. Your city has been selected for this tactic. Evacuate immediately. The technical description was so detailed that German civil defense experts studied it. Their conclusion: theoretically possible but practically impossible to execute. Creating a firestorm required perfect weather, exact bombing precision, and concentration of force that exceeded British capabilities. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, Hamburg's Nazi district leader, held a press conference specifically to address the leaflet. The enemy describes fantasy scenarios to justify their terror bombing campaign. They claim magical tactics that violate physics. A self-sustaining fire that creates its own winds, temperatures hotter than our steel furnaces. This is not military intelligence, but science fiction designed to frighten the weak-minded. The Hamburg newspapers published the leaflet alongside expert commentary from fire chiefs explaining why the described firestorm was impossible. The consensus: buildings don't burn hot enough to create such effects. Fires spread horizontally, not vertically. German construction methods prevent rapid fire spread. Hildegard Weiss, writing these reassurances in her morning paper, felt vindicated in her decision to ignore the warning. The technical experts said firestorms were impossible. The government promised protection. Only cowards fled based on enemy lies. She kept the leaflet on her kitchen table not as a warning, but as a curiosity. Proof of how desperate the British had become that they resorted to impossible threats. What German civilians didn't know was that the leaflet writers weren't guessing. They were reporting results from careful scientific study. In Britain, a team of scientists led by Professor Desmond Bernal had studied the German Blitz damage patterns and Luftwaffe tactics. They had conducted experiments with scale models and mathematical modeling. They had analyzed weather patterns, building construction, and fire propagation rates. Their conclusion: with sufficient concentration of bombs and proper weather conditions, a firestorm could be deliberately created. The Hamburg leaflet wasn't propaganda, it was the mission briefing accidentally leaked to the target. July 24, 1943. The first raid of Operation Gomorrah struck Hamburg with 728 RAF bombers. The attack killed 1,500 civilians and destroyed residential areas in the city center. German propaganda immediately declared victory. British terror raid fails, announced the headlines. Hamburg defenses destroy 50 bombers, city functions normally. Gauleiter Kaufmann toured the damage and proclaimed that Hamburg had survived the enemy's best effort. Civil defense had performed magnificently. Fires were controlled within hours. Production would resume immediately. Hildegard Weiss, whose apartment building survived undamaged, felt her faith in German defenses confirmed. The British had struck with hundreds of bombers, less than they'd threatened, and Hamburg stood firm. The warning leaflets had been lies after all. But something strange happened over the next 3 days. The RAF returned on July 25th, then July 27th, then July 29th. Each raid seemed to target specific areas around the previous damage. German fire marshals noticed a disturbing pattern. The British were creating a grid of destruction, systematically hitting areas adjacent to previous raids. High explosive bombs were shattering buildings, followed immediately by incendiaries igniting the exposed interiors. On July 27th, weather conditions aligned exactly as the leaflet had described. Hot temperatures, low humidity, light winds from the east. At 11:47 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across Hamburg. This time, 787 RAF bombers were inbound, carrying a precisely calculated mix. 30% high explosive bombs to shatter buildings and break water mains, 70% incendiary bombs to ignite the devastation. Hildegard Weiss heard the sirens and made her fateful decision. She stayed in her apartment. 3 previous raids had proven the enemy couldn't destroy Hamburg. The shelters were overcrowded and uncomfortable. She was safer in her own home. The first bombs fell at 12:03 a.m. on July 28, 1943. Within 15 minutes, the tactical situation deteriorated beyond anything German civil defense had imagined possible. The high explosive bombs shattered buildings throughout a 2-square-mile area of eastern Hamburg. Water mains broke, leaving firefighters without water. Streets were blocked with rubble, preventing fire engines from reaching ignition points. Then the incendiaries fell, over 900,000 incendiary bombs in 45 minutes. The famous British stick incendiaries, each weighing only 2 pounds, fell in such concentrations that streets appeared to be carpeted with flame. What happened next had been described precisely in the mocked leaflet. The fires merged. At approximately 1:20 a.m., eyewitnesses on the outskirts of the target area reported seeing individual fires suddenly connect into a single massive conflagration. The fire began creating its own weather, a phenomenon that German fire chiefs had declared impossible. Hot air rising from the fires created a vacuum at ground level. Cooler air rushed in to fill that vacuum, creating winds that reached 150 miles per hour, hurricane force that fed oxygen into the flames and spread the fire with supernatural speed. The temperature at ground level exceeded 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets ignited and flowed like lava. Residential buildings constructed of brick and stone exploded into flame. The fire spread not through normal combustion, but through pure thermal radiation. Heat so intense it ignited buildings hundreds of feet from active flames. The firestorm that German experts said was impossible was happening exactly as the British had predicted. In her apartment, Hildegard Weiss realized too late that she had made a fatal mistake. The temperature inside was rising rapidly. Outside her windows, she could see buildings across the street erupting into flame, though no bombs had hit them. The wind howled with such violence that windows were sucked out of their frames. She tried to flee, but found the stairwell filled with smoke. The temperatures outside had made escape impossible. Anyone entering the street was instantly incinerated. She retreated to her apartment, where she would eventually suffocate as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Frau Schmidt, who had gone to a deep public shelter despite Hildegard's mockery, survived. But she reported that conditions in the shelter became nightmarish. The temperature rose to over 140 degrees Fahrenheit inside the concrete bunker. People were cooked alive by radiant heat. Those who panicked and tried to leave were incinerated the moment they opened the shelter doors. The firestorm burned for 3 hours with such intensity that it was visible from aircraft flying over Denmark, 100 miles away. Bomber crews reported that the glow was brighter than the full moon, and they could read maps by the light of Hamburg burning. When dawn broke on July 28th, eastern Hamburg had ceased to exist. An area of 8 square miles had been completely destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Buildings had been reduced to ash. Streets were indistinguishable from the surrounding devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been incinerated so completely that no traces remained. The death toll was catastrophic. 42,600 civilians killed in a single night. Most died from suffocation or carbon monoxide poisoning rather than burns. The firestorm had consumed so much oxygen that people in shelters simply stopped breathing, often showing no external injuries. The body of Hildegard Weiss was found in her apartment 3 days later, sitting in her kitchen chair. The apartment showed no fire damage. She had died from oxygen deprivation, her body perfectly preserved by the lack of oxygen that prevented decomposition. On her kitchen table, investigators found the British leaflet warning of the firestorm. It had been accurate in every detail: tactics, effects, temperatures, even the suffocation of those in sealed shelters. German authorities immediately imposed information blackout. Newspapers were forbidden from reporting the true death toll. Radio broadcasts claimed the raid killed approximately 1,000 and that damage was less than previous attacks. But the truth couldn't be contained. Over 900,000 Hamburg residents fled the city in the days following the firestorm, an evacuation larger than the entire population of many German cities. Refugees spread across Germany carrying eyewitness accounts that contradicted official propaganda. Gerda Hoffmann, a survivor who fled to her sister's home in Brunswick, wrote in her diary, July 30th, 1943, "I have seen hell. The British leaflet described it exactly. We mocked it as propaganda. We were fools. The firestorm was real. Temperatures that melted stone. Winds that sucked people into the flames. Everyone who stayed believing German assurances is dead. I survived because I didn't trust my government. That is what I learned in Hamburg. Our leaders lie, and the enemy tells the truth." This diary, discovered after the war, captured the psychological transformation that Operation Gomorrah created. German civilians began to trust Allied warnings more than Nazi assurances. The Hamburg firestorm created an intelligence problem for Nazi propaganda that would never be solved. Allied warnings had proven absolutely accurate, while German reassurances had proven catastrophically false. Goebbels recognized the danger immediately. In his diary entry from August 3, 1943, he wrote, "The Hamburg situation is disastrous psychologically. Civilians are taking enemy leaflet warnings seriously while dismissing our own information. This represents a complete collapse of domestic propaganda credibility. We must regain control of the narrative before panic spreads." The approach Goebbels chose was to acknowledge Hamburg's destruction while reframing it as an unavoidable tragedy rather than a failure of civil defense. German radio announced, Hamburg suffered terribly from an unprecedented concentration of enemy force combined with freak weather conditions. While casualties were significant, they resulted from criminal British tactics that violate all laws of war, not from any failure of German preparation. This horror cannot and will not be repeated because the specific conditions that enabled it were unique. There are two ways. But Allied psychological warfare operators had anticipated this response. Within days of the Hamburg raid, new leaflets appeared over German cities with a simple message. Hamburg was not unique, it was a test. The technique will be repeated in every major German city. Cologne is next, then Essen, then Berlin. We have told you our methods. We have demonstrated our capabilities. Evacuate or die. Your government cannot protect you. These leaflets included technical details about the Hamburg attack, bomb loads, timing, weather conditions that German authorities had tried to classify. The level of detail convinced many civilians that the enemy possessed perfect intelligence about German vulnerabilities. Even more damaging, the leaflets were right again. Cologne was struck with similar tactics on August 23rd, creating another firestorm that killed 4,377 civilians. Hamburg survivors who had fled to Cologne believing the British couldn't repeat the attack died in a second firestorm exactly as warned. German civil defense authorities faced an impossible situation. They knew the British firestorm tactics worked. They knew German cities were vulnerable. They knew evacuation would cripple war production. But they couldn't admit any of this without validating enemy propaganda. The official response became increasingly contradictory. Civil defense manuals were updated with anti-firestorm procedures, implicitly acknowledging the threat, while public statements continued to deny that firestorms were possible or repeatable. Instructions distributed in September 1943 advised civilians. In the event of widespread fire development, seek shelter in deep bunkers and seal all openings. Do not attempt to flee through fire zones. Remain sheltered until temperatures normalize. Survivors of Hamburg recognized these instructions as death sentences. The sealed shelters had become ovens. But German authorities couldn't advise evacuation without admitting that cities were indefensible. Through late 1943, Allied psychological warfare became increasingly specific. Leaflets now included target lists, attack schedules, and technical details about bombing tactics. A leaflet dropped over Berlin in November 1943 read, Berlin will be attacked nightly until destroyed. RAF Bomber Command has assigned 50,000 tons of bombs to your city. This is not a threat, but an operational requirement. Your shelters will become tombs. Your civil defense will be overwhelmed. Your government knows this and lies to you. Evacuate immediately to areas beyond 50 kilometers from city center. The specificity was psychologically devastating. 50,000 tons, an exact figure that implied detailed planning. Nightly attacks, a commitment of resources that suggested unstoppable determination. 50 kilometers, a precise evacuation radius based on actual damage calculations. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, recognized the crisis. In a September 1943 memo to Hitler, he wrote, The bombing campaign's primary effect is not physical destruction but psychological collapse. Workers read enemy leaflets predicting attacks on their cities. The attacks occur as predicted. Workers evacuate based on enemy warnings rather than our instructions. Production suffers not from bombs but from loss of workforce confidence in our defensive capabilities. Hitler's response was characteristically rigid. Increased punishment for those spreading defeatist rumors, which included repeating accurate Allied warnings, and intensify propaganda, claiming German wonder weapons would soon retaliate decisively. But wonder weapons remained theoretical while Allied bombers were demonstrably real. Civilians learned to trust evidence over promises. The credibility gap widened further when Allied leaflets began including advice that saved German lives. Warnings specified which neighborhoods would be hit, allowing residents to evacuate those specific areas. Instructions on shelter construction that contradicted German official guidance proved more effective at preventing casualties. A leaflet dropped over Stuttgart in December 1943 contained information that should have been classified. Your city's public shelters in the Königstrasse district are inadequately ventilated for firestorm conditions. The shelters at Marienplatz have insufficient structural strength against 4,000-pound bombs. Effective shelter requires depth of at least 6 meters below ground, ventilation with external air intakes at least 50 meters from shelter entrance, structural support capable of withstanding 25 tons per square meter overhead pressure. Most Stuttgart shelters fail these requirements. German civil defense engineers verified this assessment and found it technically correct. The shelters identified were indeed inadequate. The specifications provided were accurate engineering requirements. The enemy knew more about German shelter capabilities than German civilians did. When Stuttgart was bombed in February 1944, the inadequate shelters failed exactly as predicted. Hundreds died in the Königstrasse shelters from suffocation when ventilation systems collapsed. The Marienplatz shelters suffered structural failures from 4,000-pound blockbuster bombs. Survivors reported that those who had evacuated based on British warnings survived, while those who trusted German assurances died. This pattern repeated across Germany through 1944. Allied warnings proved accurate. German assurances proved false. Civilian trust in Nazi information collapsed. Goebbels' diary entries from this period reveal growing desperation. March 15, 1944. The population believes enemy radio broadcasts over our own. Workers evacuate based on British leaflet warnings. We can no longer effectively counter enemy psychological operations because they have established credibility through accuracy. This is unprecedented in the history of propaganda warfare. The enemy wins not through lies but through truth. The psychological transformation was captured in countless civilian diaries and letters. Frau Emma Bauer, writing from Kassel in April 1944. I no longer listen to German radio. I wait for the British leaflets. They tell me when to leave, where to go, how long to stay away. They have been correct every time. My neighbor stayed because the Gauleiter promised Kassel was protected. She died when her shelter collapsed. The British warned that shelter was inadequate. They were right. Our government was wrong. I trust the enemy because the enemy tells the truth. This sentiment, repeated millions of times across Germany, represented the complete failure of Nazi domestic propaganda. The regime that had controlled German information for over a decade had lost credibility to enemy psychological warfare conducted via paper leaflets and radio broadcasts. By 1945, Allied psychological warfare had evolved into something unprecedented. Enemy forces providing accurate civil defense guidance that German authorities couldn't match. Leaflets dropped over German cities in early 1945 included exact attack schedules. Your city will be attacked on February 13th at approximately 2200 hours. Specific target areas. Bombing will concentrate on railway yards and industrial districts in the eastern sectors. Recommended evacuation routes. Leave via Highway 7 heading northwest. Highway 4 will be blocked by previous damage. Duration estimates. Attacks will continue for 3 to 4 hours. Remain in shelter for at least 6 hours after all clear sounds. The level of detail transformed Allied warnings from propaganda into operational intelligence shared with the enemy civilian population. The Dresden leaflets of February 1945 exemplified this evolution. Dropped beginning February 8th, they warned, Dresden will be destroyed February 13th to 14th. This is not a threat, but a scheduled operation. RAF bombers will attack the night of February 13th. American bombers will attack during daylight February 14th. Target zones, Central City, railway infrastructure, military depots. Expected casualties, 25,000 to 35,000 if population remains. Expected casualties, minimal if population evacuates. You have 5 days. Choose wisely. German authorities dismissed this warning as propaganda. Dresden had been largely untouched by bombing, was filled with refugees, and had minimal military significance. Gauleiter Martin Mutschmann announced publicly, "The enemy threatens Dresden to create panic among refugees. Dresden has no strategic value and will not be bombed. These warnings are designed to disrupt refugee processing and military movements. Ignore them. Dresden is safe." Approximately 200,000 refugees and residents ignored the warning, trusting German assurances. Many were Hamburg or Cologne survivors who had learned to trust Allied warnings, but exhaustion, winter conditions, and belief that Dresden was genuinely safe kept them in the city. On February 13th to 14th, 1945, the RAF and USAAF struck Dresden with exactly the attacks described in the leaflet. The raids created another firestorm, killed between 22,700 and 25,000 civilians, current historical consensus, and destroyed 90% of the city center. The accuracy of the casualty prediction, within the estimated range, stunned German intelligence. The enemy hadn't guessed or exaggerated. They had calculated expected deaths and reported it as if filing a weather forecast. Letters and diaries from Dresden survivors reveal the psychological impact. I read the British leaflet. I mocked it as propaganda. I stayed because the Gauleiter promised safety. Everyone I know is dead. The leaflet gave us 5 days warning. 5 days to live. We chose death because we believed our government instead of our enemy. I survived by luck, trapped in a shelter while the city burned. The British told the truth. Our leaders lied. I will remember this until I die. Anonymous survivor letter, March 1945. By early 1945, millions of German civilians were making decisions based on Allied warnings rather than German instructions. This created chaos in civil defense planning and military operations. When leaflets warned of attacks on specific cities, populations evacuated en masse, regardless of official orders to remain. When British radio broadcasts announced bombing schedules, workers abandoned factories and fled to countryside. The Nazi authorities had lost control of civilian behavior to enemy psychological operations. The final phase of Allied psychological warfare focused on surrender instructions. Leaflets distributed in March-April 1945 contained detailed guidance. The war is lost. Your government knows this. You will not be harmed if you display white flags. Remain in your homes. Do not resist Allied forces. Turn in all weapons. Cooperate with occupation authorities. You will be harmed if you continue fighting. Follow orders to conduct guerrilla warfare. Destroy infrastructure. Hide Nazi officials. These instructions proved more effective than any military operation in preventing German resistance. Cities surrendered without fighting because civilians trusted Allied promises of fair treatment more than Nazi promises of miraculous victory. The Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 exemplified this. Allied leaflets warned German forces, "You are surrounded. No reinforcement is possible. Surrender will result in POW status and survival. Continued resistance will result in annihilation. Choose." Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered, partly because 3 years of accurate Allied warnings had established credibility. If the Allies said surrender meant survival, soldiers believed it, because Allied promises had proven more reliable than German promises. Post-war interviews with German POWs revealed the psychological transformation. We trusted the American leaflets more than our own officers. The leaflets had been accurate about everything else. Why would they lie about POW treatment? Our officers said the enemy would execute prisoners. The leaflets said we would be fed and sent home after the war. We believed the leaflets because they had never lied to us. Our officers had lied constantly. Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, captured April 1945. The ultimate vindication of Allied psychological warfare came in the occupation period. German civilians who had learned to trust Allied accuracy during the war cooperated extensively with occupation authorities. The foundation of trust, built paradoxically through bombing warnings that proved accurate, facilitated peaceful occupation. The final statistics of Allied psychological warfare operations against German civilians represent the most successful intelligence-based propaganda campaign in military history. Leaflet distribution. 6 billion leaflets dropped over Germany 1942 to 45. 800 distinct leaflet designs. Average German civilian encountered 15 to 20 different warning leaflets. Distribution cost, $15 million, 1940s dollars. Accuracy rate, major attack warnings, 94% accurate, date target, approximate scale. Tactical predictions, 87% accurate, specific effects, casualty ranges. Strategic assessments, 96% accurate, war outcome, occupation terms. Comparative casualty rates. Cities where civilians heeded Allied evacuation warnings, 15 to 20% lower civilian casualties. Shelters built to Allied specifications, 40% better survival rates than standard German shelters. Areas that evacuated based on Allied timetables, 60% reduction in civilian deaths. These numbers tell a story that transcends military history. They represent the power of truth over propaganda, even when truth comes from enemy sources. In 1963, at a symposium on World War II psychological warfare operations at Oxford University, former RAF intelligence officers met with German civilians who had survived the bombing campaigns. The exchange provided closure to the psychological warfare story. Gertrude Muller, Hamburg survivor, addressed the British officers. "I mocked your leaflets. I believed my government when they said your warnings were lies. My sister stayed in Hamburg because she trusted Nazi assurances. She died in the firestorm you predicted exactly. I survived because I finally believed your warnings over my own government's promises. For years I hated you for dropping those leaflets. They seemed cruel. Why warn us if you plan to kill us anyway? But I came to understand you were offering us a choice. Evacuate and live or stay and die. My government offered no choice. Only lies about protection they couldn't provide. You were honest enemies. They were dishonest leaders. I learned to trust British warnings because they were accurate, while German assurances were false. This was the strangest lesson of the war. The enemy told truth while leaders lied." Wing Commander Arthur Harris Jr., son of Bomber Command's leader, responded, "We didn't drop those leaflets from mercy, though some of us felt mercy. We dropped them because we calculated that civilian evacuations would disrupt German production more efficiently than killing workers. We wanted you to flee because fleeing Germans couldn't build weapons." But something unexpected happened. We established credibility through accuracy. We told you exactly what we would do, then did it. This wasn't kindness, it was operational predictability. But the effect was that millions of Germans learned to trust enemy intelligence over friendly propaganda. This became the most effective weapon in our arsenal, not the bombs, but the credibility. When we said Dresden would be destroyed, Germans believed us and evacuated. When we said the war was lost, Germans surrendered. When we said occupation would be fair, Germans cooperated. All because we had never lied to them, even when we were killing them. The Allied psychological warfare campaign succeeded because it violated every principle of propaganda warfare known before World War II. Traditional propaganda operates through deception, exaggeration, and emotional manipulation. Allied leaflets operated through accuracy, understatement, and clinical precision. Nazi propaganda promised miracle weapons, imminent victory, and absolute protection. All lies. Allied propaganda promised destruction, defeat, and specific dates for both. All true. Germans learned through traumatic experience that enemy accuracy was more valuable than friendly reassurance. This created a credibility gap that could never be closed. Once Allies established that their warnings were accurate, Germans trusted those warnings over official German information. This trust persisted into occupation and shaped post-war German society. We learned to trust evidence over authority, verification over assertion. The bombing taught us skepticism toward government propaganda that influences German political culture to this day. The Hamburg leaflet, the one that Hildegard Weiss kept on her kitchen table as a curiosity, became a museum exhibit at the Hamburg Museum. Displayed alongside her death certificate and recovered diary, it stands as testament to the cost of disbelieving accurate intelligence. Her final diary entry, written July 27, 1943, hours before the firestorm, reads, "Another air raid warning tonight. I'm staying home. The British leaflet warns of firestorms and mass casualties, but I've read the newspaper articles explaining why this is impossible. I trust German science over British propaganda. If I'm wrong, I'll never write in this diary again." She never did. The museum placard notes, Hildegard Weiss died July 28, 1943, in the firestorm described in the British leaflet she dismissed as propaganda. Found with her body was the leaflet, accurate in every detail. Her death, and 42,599 others that night, demonstrated that sometimes propaganda isn't lies, sometimes it's truth that saves lives if believed and kills if rejected. The broader historical lesson extends beyond World War II. Intelligence, even from enemy sources, must be evaluated on accuracy rather than source. German civilians who evaluated Allied warnings based on content survived. Those who rejected warnings based on source died. Propaganda loses effectiveness when contradicted by experience. Nazi domestic propaganda never recovered from Hamburg because lived experience proved it false. Credibility, once lost, cannot be recovered through assertion alone. German authorities couldn't regain trust by insisting they were trustworthy, only by being accurate, which they weren't. The most effective propaganda is precision rather than exaggeration. Allied understatement proved more powerful than Nazi hyperbole. In the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, an exhibit on World War II civilian experience features a wall covered with Allied leaflets alongside German newspaper clippings dismissing them as lies. Visitors can compare the predictions to photographs of actual bomb damage. The exhibit concludes with a quote from an anonymous German civilian written in 1946. "We laughed at Allied propaganda because we believed our government. We died because the propaganda was true and the government lied. The British told us exactly what would happen. We mocked them. Then it happened exactly as they said. This is the lesson. Distrust promises. Believe evidence. The enemy who tells truth is more trustworthy than the leader who tells comfortable lies." The German civilians who mocked Allied propaganda learned, too late for many, that accuracy matters more than patriotism, that evidence matters more than authority, and that sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from unexpected sources. The bombers came exactly as predicted. The firestorms burned exactly as warned. The cities fell exactly as scheduled. Every mocked leaflet proved accurate. Every dismissed warning came true. In the end, Allied psychological warfare succeeded not through deception, but through the simple, terrible power of telling the truth, even when the truth was that fire was coming from the sky, and there was nothing German defenses could do to stop it. The leaflets weren't propaganda, they were forecasts, and the Germans who learned to read them as such survived, while those who dismissed them as lies died exactly as predicted in fires they had been warned were coming.